In this video, I'd like to discuss the topic of how to be or to become well-read as a person. Most of us would like to be well-read. We imagine the satisfaction and the additional knowledge and insights that would come along with becoming a well-read person. But not many people actually attain to that goal. And in fact, most people, when I've asked them, find it difficult even to explain what it would mean to be well-read. So in this video, I'm going to discuss what being well-read actually is, and then some tips on how you can become or start your journey to becoming well-read as an individual, and what that will add to your experience in day-to-day life. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? As I've already said, we're going to take a look at what it actually means to be well-read before we look at how to become well-read. There's actually a couple of definitions for being a well-read person, but there's one in particular that most people have in mind when they think of trying to go on a self-developing journey of becoming a well-read individual. But it's very important to make that idea concrete, to define it almost explicitly, so that you can direct your attentions. Otherwise, what happens is you set off with good intentions, but never reach the goal because the goal has become too vague and you hit a lot of by streets and byways which take you off course. But just before we define it, I would just like to say this one point. In order to achieve any significant goal, any endeavor to grow our mind and our appreciation, there is a quality everyone needs, and that is patience. And that's quite hard in this quick fix world. A lot of people might want just give me 5 things to do to make me well-read. It doesn't quite work like that. I can give you some tips and directions, but each of them will require patience. Now, do you have that patience? A good way to know is, can you finish this video? If you can't finish a video that tries to give you information, that might really be what lies behind any difficulties you're having to achieve goals. So what I'd suggest is, if you find that patience difficult, bookmark this video so that if you can't get through it in one go, come back and get through it in several. That's still having a patient attitude. It's not allowing you to chop and change all of the time, but to use what attention you have to progressively work through a topic. Please don't mistake that advice for being pompous or derogatory in any way. I myself suffer with inattention because we live in a fast-paced world where we expect to just click on one thing and get the answer we want. But to become truly well-read, it will require patience, and we all know it, really. What does it actually mean then to be a well-read person? The first definition of this you probably recognize. It's to be extensively read, deeply read in one particular topic. So if I were to use the sentence, the effect of Greek culture can be felt through all of the development of the Western countries, as any well-read historian knows. Did you notice there that the reference to well-read was to do with one specific topic, that of history, and that a good historian who's read across a lot of European history will recognize the influence of Greek culture. Another one, maybe from the field of science, if you were to come across an expression like this: the new compound failed for reasons that any well-read chemist would understand. So there's our first definition of what well-read is, and it gives us a clue of what we're trying to do. It's extensive in a particular area. However, when most people talk about a well-read individual, they don't just mean somebody who has great knowledge on one topic. For instance, if you met a person who was very, very informed on trees, for instance, and had read loads about trees and could tell you all about trees, you would likely call them well-versed as opposed to well-read. Well-versed sort of breaks it down to specific articles within a topic. When we tend to think of well-read, we tend to mean a second definition. The second definition of being well-read is to be broadly read. That is, to have read through a whole array of different topics and interests. But are all topics equal? I might do a video about this actually. The answer is no, and I'll give you an example here. Just say somebody has read lots and lots of books, and in those books they've read things like the whole Winnie the Pooh series, they've read all of Twilight, they've read all the Harry Potters, they've read loads of comics, they've read all the newspapers of the Sun and the Mirror, you know, the daily articles going back for 20 years, that kind of thing. Would you call them a well-read person? Probably not. So what is it amongst this broad reading that we're actually talking about when we say well-read? Well, let's just name some of the topics in this broad category that we can go, or broad categories that we can go into. There would be things like science, art. In fact, the sciences could be subdivided. You could have mathematics, chemistry, biology, anatomy. You could also have music. What about different cultures around the world? Language, literature, philosophy, religion. When we think of these categories, these are the ones we tend to mean when we talk about being well-read. And being well-read in several of those categories is what we mean as well, not just one of them. Now, why are those categories the ones we mean when we think of being well-read? Well, here's the simple answer. Those categories all help us understand better and appreciate the inner depths of ourselves and the potentials of the world around us. They give us an awakening. They elevate us to become better people, better versions of ourselves. The word we have for that is culture. In short, what culture is to take us from our most base primal bestial mode, where we could just operate with grunts and try and satisfy every human instinct that we have in a hedonistic way, I suppose, to an elevated form of ourselves, where we can start to command our environment because of our own self-discipline, because of our own perception of things. We get the word refinement from this idea of culture and focusing on the elements of life and ourselves which lift us. And it's in those categories that we become well-read. Because when we've read a lot across those categories, it affects the way we conduct ourselves, the way we speak, and other people listen and think, wow, they have such great discernment or insight. And then comes up the idea of they are very well read. So to sum up what being well read means, and if you want to be well read, this is your target. It's a blend of the two definitions. It is to be broadly read across numerous categories of life, whether that be in the arts, classically, because it's to do with beauty and emotion and sense of being, but it also involves philosophy, understanding the way we work and the way societies interact, and the sciences, which have dramatically given us an insight into the world around us. Once we read broadly, we also read to an extent. It's not just one book from each category. There is an extent in each of them. And we're going to come back to this in how to become well read in the tips for it. So it's that blend to be extensively read in numerous areas of life. The result being that you appreciate yourself and the world you inhabit at a much higher plane, get more satisfaction from it, and know how to maneuver in it maybe better than the majority. I'd like to share with you now 7 tips that will aid you in your journey to becoming more well-read. Some of these I've learned through my own experiences, much I've learned from listening and talking to very educated people. And what these 7 things will do when collectively put together is they begin to swell up like a wave, like a great body of water, but in this case understanding, which results in a great crashing of experience, appreciation and thrill as you begin to see the world and yourself more fully. So let's go into number 1. The first tip for starting your journey to becoming well-read is to select a group of categories which you are more interested in. Remember, we want to go extensive and broad, but we can't be too broad at the beginning. If you took every topic we talked about before, religion, philosophy, chemistry, biology, mathematics, history, the chances are you would only be able to read one book in each of them, and that wouldn't give you the the depth of understanding in those categories, and you wouldn't feel yourself growing. What you want to do, and I'd recommend you do this right now, just get a piece of paper and write out 3 or 4 categories of life or of self that you particularly find interesting. So for instance, you could pick psychology, you could pick music, you could pick languages, and you could pick sculpting, okay? After that, you can start reading on those topics. Which ones would you be interested in most? Now, if you want to have the more classical, well-read persona, that's going to focus mainly in the arts themselves. Music, literature, actual painting art, sculpting, architecture. It's to do with beauty and emotion. Rhetoric would come into that with language. But of course, there are so many other areas that affect us. Science, you know, there is so much classic books written on science, these seminal works that you could go into. I'm thinking of Karl Popper off the top of my head, Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. There's so many things. You would want to start reading in those. And you don't have to stick purely to an engineering, science, technology side and an artistic side. Blend them by all means. Which ones really grab your fancy? And then start building an idea of what you can read based on those categories. And maybe pick 5 books in each that you're going to read. Believe me, doing this is going to start building your appreciation rather quickly. The second tip for becoming well-read is to read for appreciation and understanding, not in order to have read. A lot of people want to be well-read, and their motive is this: so that I can sound intelligent, so that I always have something to say, so that I can impress people, so that I can say I've read these books. Although those things can happen as a result of being well-read, they should never ever be your motive in reading them. To be a well-read person takes patience, because what you're doing is you're reading to understand yourself and the world, to think a bit deeper, to truly appreciate. Within all of us, there is that hidden Pharaoh's tomb full of treasures, but you've got to work your way through the labyrinth of understanding to get at them. And the deeper you go, and the more varied your topics when you bring them together, is going to enlighten just how much treasure abounds within you and without in the wide world around. So read to appreciate. Now, what I don't mean by that, I don't mean you should pause at every sentence and struggle to concentrate and work it out. That's actually a bad way of reading. Get a book, don't get too bogged down in it, and just read through it and let it wash over you. If there's something that grabs your attention, you know, by all means, think about that. But keep on moving through, and then move to the next book in that category. And then the next book in that category. And you'll notice that through the repetition of 5 books in one category consecutively, you'll begin to recognize familiar ideas that are coming up. You'll even find ideas that conflict. And we're going to come to a tip that's going to help you. But you want to read to appreciate. Go for a walk after you've read and just think a little bit about it. Read for appreciation. Read to understand. Don't bog yourself down, but never read just to say you've read them. Because, well, someone can have read 1,000 books and still not be well read if they can't remember or appreciate anything from them. The third tip I've just brushed upon, and that is to think about the things you read. One of the biggest mistakes people make, often when talking about well-read, a lot of people are thinking about the classic books, like classic novels and literature, maybe poems as well, but normally it's the classic novels. And so they set off with the idea of, let me read 100 books in a year. The problem with that is, you may read 100 classic novels and yet still not be able or recognize you haven't drawn out as much from them as somebody else. That when a conversation comes up, you can't draw on anything you've read. So you know you've read all these books, but hasn't seemed to have impacted you. It hasn't actually allowed any new spring of information to bubble up and come out from your mouth. Those people that can do that, they're the ones who read a book and then think about the book. And I said it a moment ago. Go for a walk with the sole purpose of thinking about what you've just read. You don't have to finish a whole book to do this. You may have read 3, 5, 7 chapters. Go out and just replay that in your mind. Visualize the story if it's a story. Ask yourself, what is the author trying to get me to think about? Now, one of the ways you can do that is this simple question. In what way am I like the main character? Now, I'll hear tons of reviews which are all about, I hate the main character, blah, 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 right? Ask yourself in what way are you like them. Try to become them. Try and sympathize with them, even if you think it's not how you would act. Because believe me, the more you think and put yourself in their position, in literary fiction, what you will find is actually there's elements of your human makeup which you do recognize, and that becomes an insight. It then gets you invested into the rest of the story as you see how they deal with things. And if you're sympathetic towards them, trying to see it from their perspective, you know what? The author may teach you something about life. They may alter the way you perceive the world around you. Now that works for non-fiction, of course, too. Don't just read for a bunch of hacks and tips. If you're reading non-fiction, ask yourself, how does that relate to me? Are there areas in my life where I see what I'm reading about? History. If you were to take history as a topic, I would recommend history as one of the absolute must categories for being well read, because it is the story of humanity. It's how humans have shaped the world in which we've come into, but also humans haven't changed that much. And when you start looking at history and saying, well, is there anything I know in other parts of history that's a bit like this? Is there any way I could take the principle of what I'm reading here, even Napoleon, right? You might think Napoleon's got nothing to do with you. Believe me, you could look at Napoleon and you could find something that relates to the world around you, some principle. It's when you take the time to do that, that you get relatability. And I don't mean you relate to the character in this sense. I mean you can relate elements of life to other elements, and where they crisscross, there is always a powerful lesson, a powerful idea, a principle which, if you capture it like a glowfly inside a jar, it's mesmerizing. You get this scintilla of light. That's a bit of a tautology, isn't it? You get a scintilla of understanding that you can then begin to slowly perceive how you can use that in appreciating your life. It can change your moral disposition. It can change your etiquette. It can change the way you speak. It can change the way you react to other people. Always think over what you've read. Take the time. It's better to read 12 books in a year and think them through deeply than to read 100 and say, I've read 100. That's no good at all. The person with 12 is better read than the person who's read 100 in that case. A fourth tip is reread. So many people are, and I fall into this trap as well, we're so eager to get more and more and more knowledge that once we've read a book, we think, well, that's not new, I want something new. I can't tell you how despairing that makes me feel. So many people I see on comments on little YouTube shorts or TikTok are just like, well, that wasn't new. No, hardly anything is new. But the truth is, most people don't appreciate what they already have seen or learned. You can take things a lot deeper than they appear at first. It's all about appreciation. So once you've read some piece of literature, maybe you've read something about the history of art, the psychology of art, maybe you've read something about the development of chemistry or the understanding of anatomy, whatever it may be, astronomy could be in that. If you appreciated it and understood it, even though there were lots of parts you thought, I didn't quite get everything, I know I missed stuff, put that to one side and later on, come back to it. If there's particular books that you really sense the depth to. And either you love them the first time or you sense there's a lot more to get out of it and you appreciate it, you enjoyed that read. Make a little stack of reread books. It might be hard to reread every single book you read, so you want to become more specific here, but go back. Now, the reason for that is because it will cause you to think more deeply on it again. And I guarantee, now that you've read 5 books in one topic, in one domain, let's say geography, okay? When you pick your next 5 to read, one of those could be a reread of the first 5. And that is you're going to savor that far more. You're going to be familiar with it. But if you don't rush through thinking, I've already read this, I want something new. If you take your time to reread it again, believe me, so much more will come out of it. If you got 10% understanding from the first read, you won't have 20% after the second, you'll probably have 50%. Because you've already become familiar, you've read 4 of the books in the topic, and that's helping you to create a framework of understanding in this area. Once you do that through multiple topics, guess what happens? You begin to find where they all meld into one. Remember I said about thinking, you want to relate things, relatability? Well, if you were reading books on botany, and you've read now 10 books on botany and you've really thought about them, and then you start reading on psychology, do you know you are going to find transferable principles? It's going to make you perceive the world with a different lens. That elevated knowledge of one topic will help you go, whoa, I can understand this concept through the lens of that concept. And you know, we think in pictures. When we learn in relating things, we learn through analogy and metaphor. When we can say, oh, this is a bit like that, it takes our level of understanding to another place. And when you've got that in 4 categories, for instance, can you see how you begin to more quickly understand the world around you? And from there, by the way, you would branch out to other topics at a later point. The 5th tip for becoming more well-read is to choose books that are associated to each other. So you could pick 5 different books on history, say, and you could pick the history of the Aztecs, the history of the French Revolution, the history of Albert Einstein, the history of the Sumerian priests, and a history of caricatures. Okay, they're all unrelated to each other. Now, all of that's well and good, and all of those can be interesting. Always approach it with a deep interest that you can learn something. You will actually find crisscrosses over all of them, but you won't feel that you've got so far with them to start with. When you've read one book, if you don't pick 5 to start with, if you just pick one, the history of the French Revolution, okay. How did it happen? Maybe it's the great classic by Thomas Carlyle, you know, the 1,000-page romp through the French Revolution. Or maybe it's Simon Schama's Revolution, which is a bit more scholarly. You've read that one thing. Now, instead of racing off and studying ancient Egypt, try and get another book about the French Revolution, or maybe about the French aristocracy just before the French Revolution. That's going to help you connect ideas together. It's going to give you a more fully formed, a more rounded idea. If the first book is like the edge of the jigsaw puzzle, every other book on that topic is going to fill in. Remember, we want to read broadly, but we need to read to a certain extent. Maybe not as extensively as a PhD in one topic, but we don't just want one book on the French Revolution. The more you can fill it out, the more names you remember. The more names you remember, the easier it is to remember the accounts, the events, the dates. The more dates and events you've got, the more ideas you understand were going on in people's minds. And those ideas, you will end up with deep thinking, being able to see in the world today, and you'll be able to draw your own conclusions to whether those are sensible ideas or they're doomed to fail because you understand from this topic. Once you've gone so far in the French Revolution, maybe all 5 books were on that, well, how about you could then read 5 books on, I don't know, Egypt, And you might think, well, that is totally unrelated. That's fine. You've already built this bank of understanding based on the revolution. Now you're just going broadly into another topic of history. And that's going to lift you. You're going to learn things from that. Do you know, as you keep doing this, you will begin relating things to each other. Oh, look, Pharaoh Amenhotep did something which, yes, it's different to, we've used Napoleon, so we'll stick with him, different to him, but at the same time, I can see, how Napoleon is a bit similar here, or the Napoleonic Code and the Law of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon. You begin to make these connections, and it develops your mind and it develops your awareness. Your ability to connect ideas will make you infinitely more understanding of the world around you, make you much quicker at drawing conclusions. It will make you more articulate in explaining your ideas. That's the point of being well read, that deep appreciation, which then elevates your ability to interact with the world. So read books which are related to each other in their topic. Our sixth tip in becoming more well read is the most extraordinary tip you're going to hear, and you probably will never hear it anywhere else, and it's this: watch documentaries on the topics you're interested in. Now, some people are going to say, what? That's not being well read, that's watching television. And this is where the erroneous idea of being well read comes in. When people try to become well read in order to impress, they think that being well read is the ability to be in conversation and say, oh, yes, I really appreciated in Merchant of Venice when Portia said, it's quoting so that you look intelligent. That's not the point of being well read. It's to appreciate yourself, to appreciate the world you inhabit, to perceive it more clearly, more fully, to enjoy it, and then to elevate yourself from the basis level to the more refined culture. Not in a pompous way either, to really get the best out of the miracle that is you. Documentaries give you great information, well thought out. Lots of that information is drawn from the great books, the arguments of the past, the discoveries of science, the philosophies once used that have shaped the world today. All of that will be in a documentary, and do you know what really helps here? It helps you visualize the other things you're reading. Sometimes when you see it put on screen, it helps you lock in something you already know, and it will forever be in there as that image. And that becomes what I call the coat hanger technique. That image or that thought is something so fixed in your mind that anything else related to that topic, you hang on that image, and it makes it easier. It's like one of those mind graphs on paper, but you're doing it in your mind. Things hang upon each other. Watch documentaries, because the people that have put them together have done extraordinary research to get there. It's a little bit, sanctimonious to say it doesn't count if it's not read. It's information. It's just a different medium of learning. And it adds to that appreciation of self and surroundings. So watch documentaries. Make some time to watch documentaries on the topics you are reading. You'll actually notice that sometimes those narrators will help you understand an idea much better, and suddenly you make bigger breakthroughs in the books you're reading, which books do tend to take you to a much deeper level. So they're more extensive than a documentary. But nonetheless, this is a great tip. Please use it. The seventh tip is a tip that some will be more comfortable with than others, but I promise you this is vital. This really does take your comprehension of what you're reading to another level. And remember, it's appreciating and comprehending that makes you well read. It's not the amount you've read necessarily. Yes, it does involve extensive and broad, but if someone read broadly and extensively without getting anything from it, they're not well read. So this tip is to share what you've read with others. There's an old idea going back into the 20th century, the latter end, called graduated interval recall. And it basically says, if you learn something and then recall it at intervals, and repeat it to somebody else, you will learn it better yourself. Not just remember it, you will learn it better. You will understand it more deeply, because when you try and explain it to someone else, you have to clarify your thinking. You have to explain what it is you got out of it. And you know, the act of formulating, bringing into being exactly how the information affected you makes a huge difference. And the more you do that, you'll find that you're constantly bringing up ideas and thoughts which have value, which have come from good reading, and they become embedded in your speech. And your speech, the words you use, are the things that make the world you live in. You know, it's how many colours are in your palette. A lot of people have the primary colours and black and white. You want to have all the shades, as many shades as you can. And that's what being well-read is. When you're in the presence of someone who is well-read, when they talk about the world, when they talk about us and your experiences and what it means to be, you see the world in great colour. And that's why well-read people tend to be great company. I'm not saying they're better people, because some of them can be arrogant, others can be malevolent, whatever. But when they talk, they make you see the world in a richness that you didn't know was possible. And if you devote yourself to becoming well-read, I don't mean just spend all day reading, but going through these tips with direction, your enjoyment of your own experience and your surroundings will grow. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this video and that it's given you something to contemplate. Please subscribe if you enjoyed it, because I've got some other videos coming up which I'm preparing, which you'll also appreciate a lot. They're things like how to go about developing critical thinking, how to improve your vocabulary. All of these things improve the quality of our existence. So if that sounds good to you, subscribe. And if you want to do me an extra favour, recommend this or share this video with someone you think would appreciate it.